This record is the last remaining sounds of a high school band who became national champion 3 times in a row, the St. John Marching High School Band. Tough, competitive, professional, the students gave hope to a town whose residents proclaimed it was dying. The band instilled a sense of pride. Students were led by a gifted director, David Dalke, a band director from Fort, Kansas, who heard St. John was looking for a band director. Only problem, there was no band. Our nation was in the depth of the Great Depression. Dust storms rolled through with regularity. Crops had failed. Livestock wasn't much better. Some farmers reportedly resorted to feeding their animals tumbleweeds. The year was 1934. In a universal yet hopeless exercise, Stafford County residents lined their doors and windows with wet sheets and towels. The dust sifted in anyway. And that is where our story begins, with a town whose leaders were already saying in the 1930s that our town was dying. The world's economy was at rock bottom. The nation's unemployment rate was 22%. A new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had set up Works Progress Administration projects around the United States, building bridges, roads, dams, and buildings, such as the St. John High School and the band shell in Maxville. People were craving something, anything, to give them hope.
He was teaching in Ford, Kansas. They had a band.
That's David Dalke, the son of David Dalke. He has written a book about the success of the St. John Band and his father's leadership, knees lifted high and toes pointed, marching to the sounds of human decency.
And he heard through a friend that there was an opening here in St. John for what they called a professor of music. And I think they had, as I remember, some kind of a group of men that had some instruments and had their town band, but there was no band in the high school, junior high or high school. So he, in sort of a clandestine way, snuck out of Ford and drove to St. John for an interview. He made an appointment with them. And I remember his telling me, and later on, how he drove around the square, and he came out of a Mennonite background, Gossel, Kansas, up and around Newton, and that was quite a family. There were 8 of them, and they all played instruments. All played instruments. All played all instruments. So Dad just was very good with his musicianship. And so he said that he came and he drove around, and finally he went to and I'm not exactly sure, and so you could help me, but there was a little building where the Board of Education met. And he went and interviewed for the job. The school board, by the way, this is the book that has all this in it, which is called Knees Lifted High and Toes Pointed, Marching to Sounds of Human Decency. The school board members sat quietly, and Jake replied, "Before I say yes to your kind offer, let me ask one last question. How many students do you have in your band?" And there was an embarrassing silence. And Don Kitch, the superintendent of schools, sheepishly replied, "Well, Jake, we don't have a band." "Oh, one of our young ladies plays her grandpa's saxophone, but that's it. Now you know why we want to hire you. To develop a band. We need someone like you to lift our spirits. Our town is dying. The depression has hit us hard. Stores and banks are closing. Poverty is all around us. Crops are failing from all the dust storms. War is looming. Jake, we have very little to count on. Oh, maybe a sermon or two on Sundays gives us a temporary boost. We want to laugh and hope that life is worth living. And we believe, no, we seriously believe, that maybe, just maybe, music might be the medicine we need. Are you up to the challenge?
It's amazing sometimes how the right people in the right place can turn a town around. That's exactly what happened when Jacob Dalke moved to town. Hope began, at first in small places and little ways in St. John. Love blossomed between a soprano on the back row of the Methodist Church and Jacob Dalke, who immediately became the church's choir director. They were soon married.
But he kind of liked what he saw, except they didn't have a Mennonite church. So he said, I think I'm going to wind up at the Methodist Church, which, by the way, was an absolute, that's the reason I'm here, is because there was a little soprano in the back row. And he was directing the choir. And he asked a friend, he said, who is the first practice? Who is that little soprano in the back row? He says, well, Jake, that is Catherine Shaler, and she's taken. And so that's all he needed to hear. She came out that night. He said, I just said, let's go to Uncle Fred's drugstore and have a Coke. And from then on, the courtship started. And they got married in the Methodist Church here. So he didn't know her when he came here. That was one of the blessings of things. In fact, he had a band concert the night I was born. I was born at 7 a.m. And he spent the whole day with her. Just had to. He said, I'm not going to go to the concert. I have student directors. And the band was only about 3 years old at that time. And they were young. He said, but I'll get them. I'll get Jimmy or Billy. Bill King, Jimmy Groves. I'll get them to do the directing. Mom says, no, you need to go and honor that community. But yeah, but we've got this new son, David, and John David. Mom said, you go. And so he came that night and did the band concert. And what's so interesting about that is that he always started all of his concerts with the John Philip Sousa March. Raised that baton, he'd strut out, raised that baton, and wham, where'd they go? And he came out that night, raised the baton, and the band broke into Rockabye Baby. Yeah, makes me cry when I think about it. So that was part of the spirit of the school, the spirit of the band, the spirit of who he was. So after I did some of the writing and put some things down for grandkids, mainly it's what it was for posterity, then a good friend of mine said, you need to put that book, you need to put it out for people to read, not just the grandkids, everybody. And that was a person that worked on the staff here at the school when Dad and Mom are both there. And his name was Bill Martin Jr.
They became friends. Bill Martin Jr., who also taught at the high school and within a few years would become one of the most prolific children's book authors in the nation. Brown Bear, What Do You See? Chicka Chicka Boom Boom. Bill Martin Jr. wrote those.
He wrote, I think, over 100 children's books, but Brown Bear, What Do You See? Was as famous as anything he did. And by the way, he did that on a train on Long Island in New York in 30 minutes. 30 minutes he wrote that book. Then he did Chicka Chicka Boom Boom, and he wrote so many books. And I know Mom would always say after Bill moved on from St. John and wound up in New York City with Holt and Company writing, and Mom would always call and she'd say, let me tell you what Bill's writing now. Because they were such good friends. Cheryl, my spouse, and I would go down to Texas. He lived on Brown Bear Lane. And we'd go and see him about annually. And the last year we went, we could tell how frail he was. But he looked at me and he said, David, those years with your dad and Bill, we used to help go, he'd go out to Camp Carlisle and do the recreational, and he was a drama coach. And so he'd do all kinds of things with the band for kind of team development as well. He said, you need to put that story down. He says, you got to write that story. He said, the world needs to hear the story of your dad's band. Because, as he said, it's so magical what happened in this town right here. And by the way, Dad used to, when I told you, he said these are the best years of his life, he and Mom would talk and talk and talk about all their experiences. And I'd jot some of them down. And then I met with some of the band members. I don't think hardly anyone's alive now. But when they were, I'd come in here and sit with them. And that was fun to listen to them. They'd all say it was the best years of their lives, too. They were 70 years old at the time.
At the turn of the 20th century, Stafford County, Kansas, specifically St. John, was a boomtown, fueled by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. Town residents were seeking to build a community that marked it as civilized. The grade school was designed by the architectural firm Proudfoot and Bird, one of the nation's most prominent architectural firms. There was an opera house, a courthouse, stately churches, and a charming town square. In the days before air conditioning, Stafford County families sought out a close getaway, Camp Carlisle, a grove of trees south of town that housed a lake, a swimming pool, a handful of cabins, and room enough to run and practice a marching band. The camp was located south of Stafford, near the Ninneskah.
The band would go out there, and Dad would have band camp in the summer for the kids that weren't harvesting. He'd take them all out there for 4 or 5 days, and they'd practice their music for getting ready for the football season. Because a lot of people, believe it or not, went to the games to see the band. Didn't always go for they went for halftime because he was just so tremendous, and the band was so good as they got older and built. And so he'd go to Camp Carlisle and they'd practice. And he'd bring in Russell Wiley, who was the band director at KU, Kansas University. He was a good friend of Dad's. And he would help Dad with, try to prepare for all the contests. And he'd come in and he'd say, well, let me have the brass this time. I'll work with them, and you work with the woodwinds. And so it was great.
As the band members became more adept with their precision marching drills and band instruments, people began to take notice. Pride began to blossom in St. John. People came out to watch these marching wonders. There's an old joke. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. That's exactly what those students and their director did.
Memory, and then I looked at the sides of the street and how big they were, and I remember Dad talking about it was great to practice marching down those streets. And people would come out, have their coffee cups in hand, and sit on the curb or on the edge of the brick. Well, the sense of community for Dad and Mom was acceptance of music, acceptance of who they were as musicians, and caring for a community. When I wrote this book and I had put the subtitle on it, marching to sounds of human decency. That was the truth. They treated everybody in the community with decency. They had friends, and they had my grandparents, and they had built comradeship with people. They played bridge together, and I don't know. I just never heard them ever talk about anything that wasn't helpful and hopeful. And they had a dining room at their house that we could seat several people, and I remember they'd have people over to eat, and Grandma'd cook, and the community it grew, I think, as the band grew. Because, as Don Kitch said in the interview, we don't have much to hang on to right now. And I remember on these squares, especially over there, every Saturday night, the stores were open. Saturday night. And literally the farmers would stop early, and they would clean up. You could tell they'd come in, they'd have a nice pressed shirt on, and and their white foreheads from being out there with their caps on, and everybody did it and met just to visit. And the year was 1934, and in 7 unbelievable years, Jake created a band from 0 to 100 band members. Under his tutelage, the students learned to play. And he did. He taught every single one of them how to play. He'd let them pick out the instruments. He brought them in from Newton, the Newton Music Company, because he knew that country. That's where he grew up. And he had all the instruments, and he would demonstrate them and say, which one would you like to play? And it was their chosen instrument. And to teach them how to march with their knees lifted high and their toes pointed at state fairs, small town parades, halftime performances during high school football games. By 1941, the band put St. John, Kansas, and its 1,500 residents on the map by winning the state, the district, and 3 national concert and marching band contests in Omaha, Nebraska, Colorado Springs, Colorado, and Kansas City, Missouri. The town had been reborn. Music was not only in the air, but also in the hearts of a dispirited community. Amidst the hours and days of unexpected turmoil came the pounding of student footsteps, marching up and down the brick streets, learning to walk in precisely straight lines. The early morning hours brought the blaring of John Philip Sousa marches that pulled townsfolk to the curbs, and coffee cups in hand to hear the sounds of hope. Music had not resolved everyone's helpless feelings, but rather had embraced them.
That's not to say there weren't any obstacles to overcome. There were many. Sight reading during the national championship, for example. A dip in the students' motivation. Professor Dalke was ready to resign, but the students said no. And there were some students, when the band was traveling, who weren't welcome in restaurants and stores. Segregation was in full force. Mrs. Dalke stepped in to make those students feel welcome.
And they memorized all their music. And they would have lanterns put on their hat, and they'd turn all the lights off, and they would march, and make their designs and their formations and play. And he would just get more accolades for doing those kinds of things. But Dad used to talk about when they got ready for the 3rd national contest. This was in Kansas City. And they had practiced like everything, and they prepared. And in the nationals, what you do is you have a concert piece you play, then you have marching on an effort night. And like in Colorado Springs, they were at the Will Rogers. They stayed at the Antlers and marched out the Will Rogers field and under the lights, and then you had sight reading. And the first year they went to Omaha. They won enough contests here, district and state, and went to Omaha. And which is kind of interesting that he didn't know this, but after they did their concert number, then the judges got up and said, now, Mr. Dalke, would you please have the band stay on the stage, and we're getting ready for your sight reading, and we'll hand you the music that they've never seen. Dad said, what do you mean sight reading? He said, I wasn't told anything about sight reading. I was just told marching and concert. And they said, oh no, this is the third part of the Nationals. And he said, Dad said, I called the judge over and I said, what am I going to do? And the judge said, well, we can't. You're going to stay on the stage. I'm going to give you the music. You'll have 8 minutes to look at it. Usually it's an overture. I mean, major stuff. Give you about 8 minutes to look at it. And then I'll give you all the music of all the sections, and you're going to hand it out, and you're going to point to each one of them things they need to be aware of, because that's what he did. He spent the first 8 minutes becoming aware. Dad said, these kids have never done this. And the judge said, well, I'm sorry, but you got to do it. So the judge announced, now we're time for the sight reading, and for the St. John Tiger High School band, this is their piece. And Dad took it, looked at it, went up, said something to the kids, said, do the best you can. We've never just done something like this. And I guess it was kind of miserable. I think, you'd like to think that there was a glorious story that they just read it beautifully. No, it wasn't. But it fired them up for the years to come, to the point that the judges stood and applauded when they were in Kansas City for the very last contest that they did. That was their last one in 41. And they did the Hero Overture. And that has a great story to it. And Dad knew the story. And he just told them, put your instruments in your lap. I wrote this in the book. Put your instruments down. I'm going to tell you a story. And he captured them. He said, this is what you, look at here, notice this piece, notice that, but remember the story of Hero in this piece and play with passion. Judges stood. Gave him that. So there were two I think they were Hispanic students, but they were not allowed to eat at the restaurants when the band would go because of the tremendous, the discrimination in stores and restaurants. And she would pack food for them and take them in her car. And when the rest of the students would go in, they'd sit in the car and eat. So she was very helpful. I think those that really remembered Dad and Mom, but particularly Dad as a director, they would always associate him with creating some spirit in this town. It seems everything was falling into place for a possible third straight national contest win, and this time in Kansas City, Missouri. Except for one thing. The band was displaying unusual disinterest and lethargy. Had the students grown too accustomed to winning? Had the demanding fall schedule of performances taken its toll? Several musicians kept missing notes and entrances. There was a lack of concentration. Come on, band, pleads Jake. You're just not, and this is his language for minute, you're just not cutting it this morning. Let's try again. The band begins to repeat the number, only to have Jake stop them in the middle of it. I need your attention. Trumpets, you come in on the second beat, not the third, and clarinets, I need sharper, crisper notes from you at measure 30. Kansas City will be here before we know it. Now play like you mean it. As he directs, he keeps asking himself, what is wrong with these kids? Have they lost their desire? Maybe they have become too cocky. Have I worn them out? He stops them again. He lays down his baton, and with disappointment, he says, "Pass in your music." All of it. All of it. You aren't working nearly hard enough. You have 3 weeks till districts, and you aren't close to being ready. At this rate, we won't even qualify for the nationals. You are dismissed. Jake goes to his office and wonders if he should have accepted that position at the University of Missouri, and he never told anybody, but he had an offer to go to the University of Missouri. And they said, whenever you can get here, we want to hire you. We'll take you whenever. And I don't know whether it was head of the music department or the band instructor, or what, but it was in their music department. He had an offer. And he said he just took that letter and he put it in his desk, never said anything to anybody. He says, "Have I worn out my welcome here in this little town?" So Bill and Jimmy, his student directors, tapped lightly on the door. "May we come in?" asked Bill. "Sure," Jake says. "Want to sit down?" The boys remained standing in front of Jake's desk, and Jimmy speaks. "We want to apologize for what happened just now. Maybe we're tired or something, but we don't know." And Bill intercedes. "We want you to give us the music." Jake is surprised. "Why?" "Please, Mr. Dalke, just give us the contest numbers, all the music for each section. We will bring it back by tonight's practice." Not sure what to make of the request, Jake reluctantly hands them a stack of music, and the boys dash down the hallways, finding the various section leaders. "Hey, Tony, take the music and give it to everyone in your section. Tell them to practice every chance that they have before tonight's rehearsal. Then bring it all back to us by 6:45 so we can turn it in to Mr. Dalke." The same message was enthusiastically delivered to every section leader. Musical sounds could be heard all over the town as kids practiced during study halls, at home, and on park benches. That evening, Jake experienced the best rehearsal of the year. Confidence spilled over like the rushing waters of Niagara Falls, and the band evolved that day with a new sense of commitment and passion for themselves, for their director, and their community.
When St. John celebrated its centennial in 1979, the band held a reunion and marched once again.
The committee, where you might have been on it, I don't know, the committee picked the events of 100 years of what was the most important thing that happened. And they would do a highlight that in a parade and so forth. And when they got to the years 1934 to 41, they said, "Well, we know what that is. It's the band." So Dad and Mom, that was what, 1976 or whatever. Dad and Mom wrote all the band members that were now in their 40s and said, "If any of you are around and want to march in a parade, we'll reunite ourselves as a band. We won't play, but we'll march." I think there were maybe 35, 40 that came. And there was a little building right down the block here where we all met. And I remember I did a service for all of them that had died. And Dad and Mom had pictures on the wall of all the national and articles of when they won, especially the nationals. And I watched this group of people as they would lean back in their chairs and look at each other and think, "We once marched around that square. We had a band." Well, anyway, 35 of these people, Dad finished talking to them and explained why they were so important to him, and and Mom, and they just sat there. Dad said, all right, it's time for the parade. Let's line up. Oh, I watched, they came out of that building and they all went out and got in their same places. Bill King was here, he was a drum major. He had some wand of some kind he was using. And as they got in their places, and I was the mascot in the band at times when I got older, just a little bit. So I had a sign around that said mascot. And I stood there behind Bill, and I looked around, and everybody just knew where to stand. And finally, Dad said, band, attention, forward, march. And Bill blew 3 shots with his whistle, and they took off marching. And they marched down around this whole square. Now that's part of the legacy to me. And I was so proud. I mean, I hadn't remembered much of that because I was so little at times, but there they were. Some of them were marching still.
Community comes when people care. It comes when common values and histories are shared. It's worth having hometown pride and passing it on to the next generation that the same practice and discipline that once made national champions can maybe, just maybe, make national champions again. Go Tigers!